webinar in our series here, ongoing series about fiscal first aid, managing cash flow in a crisis, how to quickly build a working cash flow model. I'm Shane Cavanaugh, the Senior Manager of Research, and I'm just going to do a very short introduction here before we throw it over to our excellent speakers that we have lined up. This whole webinar is part of the Fiscal First Aid series, and what we're doing through this series is illustrating elements of the 12-step recovery process. And if you've been to some of the prior webinars, you've seen we've really touched on a number of these different elements. But today, we're going to be talking about something that really cuts across a large number of the beginning elements, and that's cash flow modeling. So very important to have a handle on your inflows and outflows in the short term so that you can be as nimble as possible as you deal with the recovery and go through that process. So with that, I'm going to stop and I'm going to hand it over to Susan, my colleague Susan, who's going to introduce our speakers.
Great, thanks, Shane. I want to thank everyone for joining today, and again, welcome our speakers. We have the webinar divided in a couple different areas. We're going to work through some of the cash flow basics and talk about why this is especially important during a time like this, and some of the considerations that your entity should be thinking about as you come up with different scenarios going forward for cash flow forecasting. Then we're going to be able to talk about a model that we hope will help many of you, and there'll be a robust resource section at the end to help you facilitate your ability to run cash flow forecasting. But to get things started, I want to welcome Stefan Jasulak, who's the Chief Financial Officer and Director of Administrative Services for the Mid-Peninsula Regional Open Space District in Los Altos, California. In that position, Stefan is responsible for finance, information systems and technology, procurement and grant management, in addition to other items. We're happy to have Stefan as he led the efforts in the Treasury and Investment Management Committee on the updated cash flow forecasting best practice, which is on the GFOA's website and was just recently updated late last year. He's also a frequent GFOA training speaker. We also have with us Corey Camp, who is the Finance and Central Services Division Manager for Anoka County, Minnesota. He's also the Vice Chair of the GFOA's Treasury and Investment Management Committee and is a frequent speaker at GFOA conferences and training seminars. Last, as we get into the modeling, but certainly not least, we have Chris Swanson. Chris is the founder of the Government Finance Research Group. He has over 20 years of experience related to government and corporate financial management, and has developed complex economic and financial models implemented to help with performance measurement systems and led process improvement initiatives in public and private sector organizations. So I think you'll enjoy what Chris has to say in developing a model to help you. And then again, we have other resources along the way. As an overview for what we're going to cover here, we're going to talk about our best practices in cash flow forecasting, how to rethink running scenarios for today's landscape, running those forecasts, and then address any questions that you have. We do have a question and answer box on the right side of the platform, so please be sure to ask questions there, and we'll get to as many as we can within that. There are also going to be some questions asked throughout the presentation for CPE credits, so there'll be 3 of those throughout the presentation as well. With that, I'm going to hand it over to Corey to start talking about our cash flow forecasting best practices. Oh, we're going to start right away, sorry, with our question. And please, for the attendees, please answer this question. You'll see, again, the prompt over on the right-hand side of the screen. Typically, how often does your entity prepare a cash flow forecast? Daily, weekly, monthly, quarterly, no formal forecast is completed, or other? So you just take a moment and submit that question over on the right. That would be terrific. Let's see what the answer is, and then we'll get the ball rolling. All right. I think we'll just move forward with the presentation and look to see what the polling results are and report back on that as Stefan and Corey move forward. So with that, Corey, I'm going to hand this right over to you.
All right, thank you, Susan. This is and I'm going to start this out, and I'll probably turn part of this over to Stefan very shortly, but we want to start talking just about the importance of cash flow forecasting. Before we get into showing you a model and showing you how all that works, because that's all good and stuff we need to do. Cash flow forecasting, we need to ensure that we have enough available to meet, our current needs. So do we have enough liquidity? If we don't do cash flow forecasting, we're not going to know about impending budget problems. It helps warn about impending budget problems. Cash flow forecasting also is a good projection of anticipated receipts. So as revenues change or not, it's good to have that in your back pocket and understand how that works. It's also good to understand how your outflows are. How are your disbursements? What's happening? And where are your investable cash balances? How much can you invest? When can you invest it? And that all, and all of that. And keep in mind, it should always be done. If you haven't been doing it, now's a good time to start. But hopefully, many of you have been doing it. It's not just in a crisis that we should cash flow forecast. We should always be looking at that. Stefan, why don't you jump in about the best practice? I know you had a lot to do with that. So
Corey, let me just butt in to say that if you look at the survey results, we do have about 30% who have no formal forecasting completed. So I'm sure there'll be a lot of pointers they can gain from this webinar. So thank you.
Thank you, Corey, Susan. Let's look at the importance of cash flow forecasting and how it works. GFOA has developed the best practice. It's available on the website, and there's a lot of good best practices on there and resources. But for the cash flow forecast, as Corey mentioned, they're used to make sure that we have sufficient liquidity, basically by estimating our inflows and our outflows. Of course, with those inflows and outflows, you have to coordinate your timing, which will then give you your whole spending pattern, and you can mitigate any kind of shortfalls that you may see coming up on your cash position. It's recommended, highly recommended, that you develop at least a 12-month rolling forecast, so not just a fiscal year basis. For example, if you had a fiscal year basis forecast, this is now April, almost May, you wouldn't know what's happening in July. So make sure it's at least a rolling 12 months, or preferably even longer. Also develop, to meet your disbursement requirements, knowing when your cash is flowing out, and that way you can also limit your idle cash, and thereby also maximizing any investment opportunity. And it's very important, especially nowadays, that forecasts are based on conservative assumptions. So basically, don't overestimate your revenue and don't underestimate your expenses. The development of the components of the forecast should reflect your traditional inflows and outflows, those that you know and that are regular, recurring, but also ensure that you slide in capital projects, any kind of non-capital projects, if you have anything coming up with disaster preparedness, and anything that might be a new service, basically where there's a beginning and an end to something. Make sure that those slide in as well. And then it's very important to review and update your cash flow routinely, analyze it, have a feedback loop, if you will, and then report out on your cash forecast. It could be up to management or up to your council, commission, board, etc. Cash flow forecasting, we sometimes say it's an art, not a science, or maybe it's a science, not an art. But basically ask yourself, how much cash is available, right? And also, when will it become available? And then if you match that up with the third question of how long it will be available, they'll give you the basic ingredients you will need. So basically, cash flow forecasting, don't change that. the concept doesn't change, but it's your assumptions that are changing, whether it's your growth percentages, your decrease percentages, your regularity of outflows might change. But your basic model, your forecast itself should not change.
All right. Stefan, here, let me jump in here on this one.
All right.
Cash flow and your entity in COVID-19. Obviously, we've seen a lot of changes. Right now, our greatest challenge is understanding our revenue streams and is being impacted. That seems to be where we're seeing the biggest crisis. The impacts are hitting us from all angles: Fed, state legislation. You have different orders to close. Every state has different orders or different ways that the governors are approaching closures, what can be open, what not to be open. County and city councils and district boards are all trying to figure out, what does this mean? What programs can I even have open? You've seen libraries close, you've seen license centers close, you've seen park systems or golf courses, all of that closed. Golf courses were allowed to open in Minnesota here this last weekend, but in many places, a lot of these services are closed, or a lot of things that government does are closed. Utility budgets are going to be impacted as well. Look at delayed tax and fee payments. How do we deal with delayed tax and fee payments? How are our cash flows? Do we have enough cash or liquidity? And that goes back to the question Stefan just asked. Have you built that in? And also deferred tax and fee payments. What's deferred, what's not deferred, and what's causing it to be deferred? And then lost tax and fee payments. If you think about it, if the program is closed, it's not deferred or delayed, it's lost. But maybe you think it's deferred or delayed, but later on you find out it's lost. How do you handle that? And that gets into the nimbleness and flexibility of your cash flow model and what we have to do in taking a look at this. And I think the most difficult thing we face right now is the duration of change. We don't know what the duration is going to be. We don't have, nobody knows when this is going to be over. So the duration just keeps going and going. And so whatever we forecast, we may reforecast a month later. So it's keeping on top of what's going on with our revenues, saying, oh, I think right now we're going to be down 40%, but now you find out, well, now it's 50% a month later because we didn't open up like we thought we would. Things kept going, things kept changing. We also need to account for some new federal funding inflows. With some of the stimulus packages, grants are flowing in to help others. Grants that might be attached to public safety or public health initiatives, just even helping local government cover some of the administrative costs, the whole FEMA declaration, and how you're tracking those costs. All of that is coming into play within every organization across the
Yeah, and if you look at your receivables, take a look at where you're most vulnerable. Right? Which types of receivables are your large components of your overall receivable, and focus on those first, see how those play out and where you're most vulnerable. Don't focus on something that might only be 0.5% of your total annual income. Right? Focus on the big buckets first, and try to lay those out as best as you can, based on your historical knowledge and what you think is coming forward, knowing that, like you said, Corey, you'll be adjusting it monthly or perhaps even weekly at this point.
Right. An example to what Stefan's saying, many of our jurisdictions rely on sales tax. Well, sales tax is probably taking a large hit. How are you handling that? That could be a large one. Property tax is another one. That one is not necessarily being hit in the same way, but it differs in every state, depending on what the state legislatures are doing and what some of the local boards are doing and how those are collected and when they're due and stuff. So those are all topics of conversation. But yes, look at your major sources. Don't worry about maybe parking fees are a very small part of what you have. Don't worry about it. If they're a large part, you might need to worry about it. Utility payments, that could be a problem, or maybe it won't be a problem. It depends on your situation and who's paying or not paying, but that's all part of looking at it. So Going on, as you anticipate, well, why don't we back up one slide for a moment. As you look at the anticipating your changes in payables too, one of the issues that we're finding is just because we've closed down services and even furloughed employees, we're still paying them to some degree. And so that may or may not impact your cash flows negatively or positively. So how is that happening? So you may now have part of your workforce not being productive because they can't do anything, but you're still paying them. And that's be a common theme probably in local government in some places. So, and the other one is monitoring your investments. What's happening with your investments? You know, understand what kind of interest income still is coming in. What's the callability of your portfolio? Because that will affect your cash. Either that shows, hey, I got cash coming in when I need it as liquid being called, or that could be a problem, meaning, oh, if I wanted to deploy or reinvest, now things are a lot lower. Also, understand from your investment advisor and manager about what best to manage that liquidity. If you end up having to sell, which ones should you sell or not sell? Stefan, any comments on that one?
We've had a lot of our investments being called right now with the low interest rate environment. Yeah, okay. Definitely check up on your call dates and maturity dates and match it into your cash flow.
All right, to Stefan's point, when you think of creating a cash flow or having a cash flow, you want to identify your major sources of revenue, and you want to keep this at a high level. Anoka County, we take it holistically, and I'll talk more about that in a little bit. But as you develop your major sources of revenue, you know, there's going to be what kind of taxes, whether it be sales tax or property tax or that may fund your government. Maybe you have some large fees coming in, whether it be utility revenue. Maybe it's, you know, parking fees or park fees if you have a large park system. You get a lot of program fees coming in. Those are just some of the ideas that you may put in here. Library systems, if you have a large library system. You know, grants are going to be a big one. How much are you getting in federal grants if you have a lot of grant-funded programs? So you want to be able to, you know, historically take a look at when those monthly receipts are coming. I would document it. I would go back at least 12 months, if not 24 months, just to get a trend history. You know, running like 12 to 24 months in the past, but that's actual. That can show you a nice trend going forward. So when you forecast out and make sure you're forecasting at least 12 months out, and that's that whole rolling 12-month concept, is going to help you understand where things might be going or where things had been. But just because they've been that way doesn't mean they'll stay that way. But at least you have data to and seeing where do the problems seem to be arising as revenue comes in or doesn't come in. Okay. As we look at outflows, considerations, and expectations, you also want to do the same thing on this side. What are your major expenses? Chances are payroll is one of your biggest ones, salaries and wages and benefits. So that one you want to have up there at the top. Probably large contracts, maybe some large contracts for services you offer, whether it be on a social services, whether it be utilities, whether it be, you know, a park system or whatever contracts you're working in or libraries. Other ones are major construction projects or major capital projects. You may want to build those in, things you know, and those might be more sporadic, but having a line to build those in is probably important because they can have a huge significant impact on your cash. So make sure you've identified what those are, identified what the normal bills are going out as well through this time. And again, going back 24 months, take a look at the expenditure side, understand the trends. One of the things I think you may find in government is very trendy. And what I mean by that is we spend the same way every year. We're very consistent, generally speaking. Revenues can sometimes be more inconsistent for us than actual expenditures. And that's what we've seen in the past, unless there's some dynamic change. And again, we've seen some dynamic change this time, so that may affect your expenses as well. So keep that in mind. Identify what those key elements are and try to document that and try to determine the horizon. Again, the duration of this crisis does affect our horizon. We don't know what it is, but we some assumptions and move forward and be nimble and keep updating those as we go. And I understand, go ahead, Stefan.
Yeah, and I mean, to develop the cash forecast, make sure you don't do it in a vacuum. Talk to the other department heads, see what, especially nowadays, but also under normal circumstances, see what's coming up, what is changing. Did the major capital project change? That will be under normal circumstances. Right now, you also want to talk to other department heads to see which contracts have been frozen, canceled, deferred, etc., to adjust your outflows accordingly. So by frequent communication like that, to build up a big picture of what is happening within the organization, almost down to a detailed level, that you can more accurately adjust your inflows, but also your outflows based on developments. Couple-week horizon with bringing out new information or shelter in place, or opening up. All these factors play into it, and you're going to need to draw on all of that collective knowledge to create a most accurate picture.
All right, thanks, Stefan. Also, once you've kind of got your basic cash forecasting model set up, you've got your revenue categories, your expenditure categories, you've put everything together, know what your monthly forecast looks like. But now you've got all the elements in play. Now, what's changing? Is the payroll as is, or is something changing? So you need to determine your liquidity needs. You need to look and see what adjustments are coming with revenues. What do I know that I didn't know? Talking to the department heads, maybe there's some new information coming in. Oh, geez, I have this huge contract coming. Forgot to tell you, so now you need to put that in play. You need to continue to work with the people, with the department heads, and then also understand what your liquidity need is. Now, one of the problems we can sometimes come into with the duration of this crisis is anticipate normal liquidity, but now what if that goes away? The revenues aren't coming in, my liquidity is getting low. How do I manage that? So now we need to create liquidity. Well, there's some different ways we can go about it. What are your plans to do that? It could be taking some investments, selling investments. Again, you need to look and see what investments should I be selling. Because sometimes what you think you can sell, the markets are not kind to. And we kind of went through that, especially earlier in this situation where markets were so volatile. On which type of security you sold, you were going to take a huge loss, and you had to be careful about how you approach that. That's why I would definitely get advice. If you're into a position where you need to sell securities, get some advice, understand what makes sense for you in your current portfolio to be selling first, which ones would be the best way to go. Sometimes it might be an advantage to look at a loan or a line of credit through working with your bank or something. There are usually laws or debt laws you have to be mindful of. That's something you can look at and see, and that can be another backstop on what you want, on what you can. Stefan, any comments on this?
No, you got it.
Okay. So now as we look at developing appropriate forecasts, there's many ways you can develop forecasts, and you might have multiple forecasts. You might have a holistic forecast that helps you look at your cash throughout the whole organization, but you might have some individual forecasts for some individual areas because they're specialized funds. So you might have it by fund, because if you have bond proceeds, you can't just run off and spend them wildly. You have to make sure you're spending them appropriately under what meets the need, because many of us have bond proceeds sitting in our fund balance today, so we can't just use that for any old expenditure. We have to make sure we've accounted for that appropriately. So we also want to take a look at our scheduled forecasting. We may be right now in a position where we've seen revenue go down so drastically. We may be taking a look at things daily and almost weekly on certain revenue sources. So it might be a mini forecast on that revenue to see how's that trending. Is that trending down? Are we bottoming? Is it going to start to come up? And how do I report that, and how do I understand what that impact's going to be on my holistic cash flow? In addition to that, the whole project-based forecast. Is there a specific project, again, that can somewhat tie into the bonding, where I have a special forecast that I need to manage and see, am I going to have enough cash to meet the needs of that project that we're continuing to do?
Yeah, and stress test your forecast, and maybe that ties in. There was a question about the best practice for all these projections, since we're in such unknown territory. Definitely by stress testing, if I could take revenue as an example, I mean, a lot of people have, or a lot of entities have property tax. Well, property tax is typically based on a roll that is established in California, is established January 1st. So for fiscal year 21, the upcoming fiscal year, we already know what a property tax will be. And then we're expecting a flattening or some kind of activity downward after that. But like sales tax are typically remitted on a 2-month lag. So you can calculate that and see when the prices started to hit and start reducing that by stress testing it. Same thing with any kind of hotel occupancy tax. Chances are that travel aren't going to return to normal for quite some time. You can take a lot of those kinds of assumptions and play around with them by stress testing the forecast.
Okay. All right. Looking at intersection of cash flow and investing, again, it gets back to our discussion of, will there be a need to tap either your short or long-term investments? Sometimes you have to tap when you didn't expect to, and make sure you're talking with the right people to determine which investments make sense. Maybe it makes sense to sell. I have some treasuries. I want to sell those first before I get into my agencies. And maybe I don't want to sell the municipal bonds I have on because I don't like the result of the loss that I will experience. So, most of us try to hold our investments to maturity. So this is a different way of thinking, and selling is not something we do often. And so this is why we need to keep that in mind. And also, do you have a core investment portfolio that's set up, or, reserves, and when do you tap into those? Can you access anything that's maturing coming up soon? Are there other funds out there that you hadn't been thinking about that you can move around a little bit? So, and again, what are your long-term goals? The goals and investment policies. The entity's investment policy may be a hindrance in this case, or a factor. Does your investment policy allow you to sell? Many of us have clauses in our investment policy that limit the selling because that's something we don't do generally. But we're in different times, and so you may have to change that or take a look at that, dust that off, and say, whoa, I'm going to need to do this in order to maintain liquidity, but my policy is not letting me. So you may have to talk to your board and say we need to make a shift or a change. These are some things to think about.
All right, we're at our second question here for CPE. And so the question here is, has your entity run a cash flow forecast to address the fiscal challenges related to the COVID-19 crisis? Yes, not yet, but planning to soon, or no, with no plans to. So please answer this. And I want to remind everybody that this webinar is worth 1 CPE credit based on the NASBA standards for a 50-minute hour. You will be receiving your CPE certificates in the mail about 3 to 4 weeks following the end of this webinar. So we're going to just move forward, and we will get back to how the polling ends when we see those results. So with that, we're talking about running the new scenarios for today's landscape.
Okay. So we touched on it a little bit already as far as the stress testing, basically developing a best case scenario, a worst case scenario, and a likely scenario that will probably be somewhere in the middle of that. And you can develop as many scenarios as you need to depending on your different cash streams. You want to identify scenarios that you're currently using so you can compare it to those that you're using to address the crisis. We have a baseline and a new scenario of what has changed. Be sure to document your methodology. Keep notes on your assumptions. Make sure that that is clear. You may have to refer back to it or explain it to other people, or just be able to research it back, because you will be running scenarios frequently with different types of input. Try to use the same model. I think that's very important. That way you can consistently compare the two. When you have new scenarios with the same model, at least you have apples-to-apples comparison. And then you could also use a new or never before used model to run scenarios, but then make sure that you first create your baseline based on 12 or preferably 20 months back history to project forward, and then start running your scenarios based on that. So you could, if you have a current scenario and you'd like to update that, you can do so. Then as far as best approach, of course, start with internal worksheets, any kind of information that you have in there, any kind of external information. And track your weekly tax revenues based on year-over-year comparisons and see how that's changing or has changed. And then stay up to date on any kind of federal or state legislative impacts, whether it's deferrals, could be positive or negative. You could see new grants coming in, of course, but make sure you stay up to date on all of that so you can layer that into your scenarios and into your cash flow forecasts. So that puts us into our first case study, and that's actually mine. I'll talk to that a little bit. Our controller, which is a board-appointed position, has been running a 30-year model for over 40 years. He's been doing this for quite a while. So we have that model, and we update it frequently, which will give us any kind of heads up as to anything we need to adjust to. We're in the fortunate and possibly enviable position that our revenues are at least 95% generated by property taxes. That means that for the next year and a half, we're not expecting huge changes, but we are preparing for either zero growth or perhaps even a slight decrease for the year after that. So, as far as that goes, we don't have a lot of moving pieces on the inflows right now, but for example, the outflows for us do change because we have suspended a lot of activity. And then as far as presentation to the elected body, we are in the middle of our budget development for next fiscal year, and all of that will be included in our first committee meeting, which is coming up in 2 weeks. And that's when we're going to the elected body with any kind of changes. We have, of course, in the meantime, updated them at least on a very, very high level of our positions and forecasts. That's pretty much what we're doing right now. And again, because we don't have a whole lot of impact yet, we don't update anything with the rating agencies just yet either. We issued bonds a couple of years ago, so we don't have to do that either. So it's going pretty well as far as that goes. Corey, you want to talk about Anoka County?
Yeah, thanks, Stefan. So Anoka County, I'll kind of be kind of quick about this, but yeah, we have a kind of whole model forecast cash flow that we've been using, and go to the next slide, Susan. What we do is we got about $200 million, but $37 million of it's outsourced. We've worked with our investment advisor to kind of help us get liquidity options available in case we run into a problem. In Anoka County or in Minnesota, we collect all the property taxes that come in. It's about 50% of what we get. We collect it for all the cities and schools and special districts, and we distribute it twice a year. We get a lot of cash in for a spell, and then we get rid of that cash. And so that just helps, that makes our model kind of unique in that way. And so we do daily liquidity monitoring. We have a cash flow spreadsheet. We have 2 years back and we have 2 years forward. And so we've been really looking and managing our trends going forward, and we take it at a very high level. We plan our investment maturities so around that cash and cash deficit so that we have money available, liquidity money, but we're being as fully invested as possible. And we talk to the departments very frequently about projects so we get it plugged in. So if you go to the next slide, this is an example of our current pre-crisis cash flow that we use. It shows last year's actual, a projection, plus for that month what the actual occurred. And so when you get out there, we have a projection and we can take a look back at 1 year. So we can see it all in one quick view, and we've been doing that well. And so we're happy that we're able to use the model that's going to be shown to you in a couple of minutes here too, because that is another way for us to look at the cash flow. So I'm very glad that we did that. So that's an addition to this and helped us kind of take a look at it from a crisis. In addition, if you go to the next slide, we got a couple graphs here. What we've done is we've taken the information from the model you're being shown, and we've created some graphs like this. And this we showed our board on Tuesday. And so saying, okay, in Anoka County, we have a large water park that the board decided to close last week for the summer. So that obviously has a huge impact on our revenues in June, July, and August, and you can see that, and there might be some other, rentals, space rental, building rentals that we are going to lose money on, and we're forecasting that knowing that this could forecast down coming in the near future. And the last slide I have before we run into the model, looking at sales tax. Sales tax is a big one for a lot of people out there. We have a transportation sales tax that comes to us for roads. What we're expecting based on some look that we did, about 45% of our sales tax dollars come from retail operations in the county. And so we're just making some assumptions that we're going to see a 40% drop. Now, we might be wrong on this because we don't really have any data, and sales tax was delayed by 30 days to help businesses out by the governor. So this is all kind of flowing, but we started with a model to show something saying we're going to be adjusting these and coming back to you and keep you informed. And that's something you want to do with your major revenue sources going forward. With that, I'm going to turn it over to our forecast speaker, Chris.
Great. Yep, we'll run it over to Chris. Let's ask our third question first, and please tell us your level of Excel proficiency. Is it A, basic, B, intermediate, C, advanced, or you're just a super expert and Microsoft calls you? So please take a moment to answer that. And I would note that from our last question on have you run a new scenario based on what's happened with the COVID-19 crisis, about 44% of you have not done that yet. So hopefully you'll see some tools here to do this and some considerations on what is best for you. And with that, we'll wait to see what comes out of this question. But Chris, if you want to go ahead and we can just look at those answers later, that'd be great.
Okay, thank you, Susan, very much. We're going to talk about now the case for a simplified model, and when is there a case for one? Well, basically, when you don't already have a very detailed, robust forecasting model, you need to create one very quickly. You might have some limited resources, and you got to get this thing up and running. So what we've developed are a couple of different approaches to having a very simple method using Excel to do a forecast up to 36 months out into the future, and also bring in some of your historic data to help you determine the seasonality of your current year budget. We're saying Excel because most every person's got Excel on their computer, so it's a tool that's available everywhere. And our approach to the simplified model is it's structured in a way where it can be put together very quickly, as long as you've got the basic data in hand, and either use the models that we've created or perhaps build some on your own using ours as a guide or a model. you could get up to speed very quick putting together a monthly forecast. The reason for it also, obviously, as we've been hearing about from the other speakers today, is that it provides you a quick view into your cash position or your fund position for the current fiscal year, month by month, and then out into years 2 and 3. That will help you make decisions about course correction, spending decisions, other perhaps emergency measures you might be taking given the current crisis. So for all those reasons and more, it makes sense to have at least a simple model in place if you don't already work with a more detailed model. Having the simple model in Excel, and you'll see the 2 examples that we have. One is literally 1 worksheet long. It's called the super simple model. The other is 4 worksheets, but really it's only 1 worksheet's data assumptions, and the other is your graphic and tabular output. And so because it's so brief, you can make multiple scenarios and just save it in different files. Or if you want to kind of tinker it with on your own and develop your own Excel model, you could obviously approach the multiple scenario requirement differently. Initially, what you want to do with a simple model, and one of the speakers alluded to this earlier, is that you want to determine what the goals of the model are first. Are you modeling a single fund? Is it general fund? Is it a special revenue fund? Is it a group of funds? Is it a pooled cash position, perhaps? Whatever it is you plan on modeling, you want to make sure that's very clear, because when you collect your data, your revenue data, your expenditure data, your starting and ending balance data, you want to make sure everything's apples to apples. And so be very clear about that up front. You can use the model right offhand just to see whether or not, based on your assumptions, are you going to stay solvent? Will the fund or the cash position remain above 0 or remain above a certain minimum policy metric or parameter? And also, when you're doing your monthly projection into the future, if you're looking at current fiscal year, you're looking 1 month out, 3 months, 6 months to the end of the fiscal year, and then into the next fiscal year. Given the situation that everyone's dealing with today, you're going to have to, at minimum, look at it on a month-by-month basis, and then, as some of the speakers mentioned, they even look at it on a daily basis to constantly fine-tune your assumptions. But this will help you pinpoint where your the points in the future in your timeline where you might have to make some adjustments now to prevent a problem in the near-term future. With the simple model, unlike a more robust, comprehensive forecasting model, you might rely on your system. If your system can generate some quick reports that would provide revenue and expenditure information, perhaps at a summary level basis, that would prevent you from having to get into the super detail of your GL data, where you might have thousands and tens of thousands of rows of GL accounts. You can certainly use that in a robust model, but for the simple model, we're talking about just being able to aggregate your major revenue sources, whether it's property tax, sales tax, intergovernmental shared revenues, charges for services, whatever those might be. Same thing on the spending side, salaries and benefits and your non-labor expenses, to group them into a very manageable, small number. And you could also perhaps refer to some of your historic documents. Maybe you have monthly or quarterly reports that you can go back in time and grab a couple of years worth. Could help prepare the model to do your projection of your baseline, and also just to track your actuals on a monthly basis at minimum as you update the model through the current period. Another major important issue to remember is that to separate out your recurring from non-recurring categories in your revenues and expenditures. You want to make sure not to lump together perhaps some non-recurring items that you'll see in your revenues perhaps are going away. You don't want to over-project those into the future. On the expending side, certainly you do not want to lump your capital spending or your debt obligations along with your recurring operating expenditures. And so at minimum, you want to separate out recurring from non-recurring. Now, we're going to get toward the end of this the slide presentation, we'll actually get into how to set up one of these models. But I just want to show you this real quick. Don't expect anyone to read the fine detail, but this is a couple examples. This is Anoka County 36-month forecast. Beginning with the current fiscal year, we've got 12 months of the current fiscal year, and then 24 months beyond that. So what this shows you right off the bat is the seasonality of your inflows and your outflows. You can see when your revenues are, peak throughout the year, and when your expenditures peak, and then the corresponding fund balance or cash flow balance that is driven by the net of those inflows and outflows over time. So in this example, this shows kind of a steady state situation over a 3-year period, 36 months. Obviously, depending on your situation, the seasonality will look different. And even if perhaps the outflows are exceeding the inflows, is what's currently happening today with a lot of local governments being pinched with the impacts on their sales taxes, charges for services, other revenue sources. You might even see some red ink in terms of your cash balance. And so by having this monthly projection, you'll be able to spot where the problem is going to happen, in the timeline. And you can also see where your balances are measured up against your policy minimums where you want to be. Another example, we talked about the open space district here. One of the speakers talked about that. This is an example of, where the balance is a healthy balance projected over the years, and it has a different nature to its seasonality of its inflows and its outflows. Again, we'll get into some more detail when we walk through an actual model. Another thing when you set up your forecasting model, you do this with all models actually, is to constantly validate it. Make sure you're on the right track. So when we say that, we mean if you're projecting a cash flow balance or a fund balance or unassigned fund balance into the future, compare what the model is saying month by month with what your actual ending balance is that month. And when you do that, you can right away tell whether or not you're apples to apples with your starting balance that you're beginning with. Are your inflows and your outflows, your revenues, expenditures, are they apples to apples with that balance? If it's a cash balance, then your revenues and expenditures, if they're not cash-based, you might have to make adjustments for non-cash items, accruals, things like that. So just be sure you're consistent with the balance that you're starting with, and then what the model is projecting into the future in terms of your assumed revenues and expenditures. Where to from here? I guess, Shane, we'll pass it off to you.
Sure, absolutely, Chris. Thank you. So yeah, a couple options for folks is we've got 2 Excel models that you can download from www.gfoa.org/FFA. We've got a simple model. Chris mentioned it's got 4 different tabs to it, and the super simple model has 1 tab. So the simple model has very detailed instructions on it. And we also have a YouTube video that is at the website to walk you through the detailed step-by-step instructions on how to do that. I think the benefit of this is if you miss something, you can rewind as many times as you want, rewatch as many times as you want. So I think it'll be an excellent way to get there. And we actually had Stephen and Corey went through this model just based on the instructions Chris put together without any help. So it is meant to be really simple, that you can get through this without having to have with just the instructions that are provided. So just if you're wondering where you can get that more precisely, if you go to www.gfoa.org/FFA for fiscal first aid, you will see the training courses all listed out, and there you'll see the managing cash flow in a crisis. You would click on that and you will get a whole bunch of different options in terms of the simple model, the super simple model. We've even included the versions that have the Anoka County and Stefan's data in them. So if you want to see a model with actual data in it, that is available to you. If you want a blank model, that is also cool. That's available, and you can also access the YouTube. So at this point, we are going to move into question and answer, and the slides are also available, by the way, at that same page. That question come up, so you can get the slides there if you want. So at this point, we're going to move into the question and answer section. There are a lot of questions. I think some of those questions have specifically to do with the Excel model. So we're going to start to pop up that Excel model. I assume everybody can see my screen right now, where we've got the what we call the data input and assumptions tab. Correct, Chris?
That's correct. And just to point out real quick, as Shane mentioned, there are 4 tabs. The first tab is an instructions page. And so if you follow the instructions on that page, it takes you step by step through, what's necessary to fill out this model. And the note at the top is just to be sure that, this is not a full-blown detailed cash flow statement. It's an approximation. It's a way to get up and running real quick and get a generally, a good, fairly accurate picture where your cash position is, your fund balance position is. So if you follow the steps, it references tab 2, where we started looking at the data and assumptions page. So this is the only page that you would be filling information out. So tab 1, instructions. Tab 3 is just your cash flow chart. Tab 4 is a reference chart to give you some ideas for things to keep in mind when you're doing your revenue expenditure forecasting. Now, at the top of this page, tab 2, the very top, column B, row 2 and 3, you want to indicate what is your ending fiscal year. Obviously, some are June 30, some are September, some are December. Whatever your ending fiscal year is, plug that in first. And then secondly, what is this are you modeling? Is it the general fund? Is it another fund? Is it a group of funds? Is it a pool of cash? Whatever that is, want to define that. And then on the left-hand side, step 3, you indicate what your revenue. Oh, go ahead. Sorry, Shane.
I would say, Chris, I think you also answered one of our questions that came up as folks were looking for examples of expenditure categories. You can see the model has helpfully laid out a number of different categories that you might have. And this might actually also be a question for Corey. So I think this is relevant to you. There's a cell right there called fiscal disparities that might have caught people's eye, or apparently has caught some people's eyes on row 33. Corey, can you tell us a bit about what fiscal disparities is?
Yeah, sure, Shane. Fiscal disparities in Minnesota is a unique property tax cost sharing that happened with commercial properties. It goes back to 1971, and basically 40% of all the growth in commercial and industrial properties since 1971 is put into a bucket. This is for the 7-county metro area, and then is redistributed based on based on a couple criteria such as population and value and kind of valuation. And so that's really what it is.
Thank you, Corey. I think that makes a great point, is that this, Chris, and I think you can speak to this, is customizable, where there are some suggested categories, and this gives you a good, I think, sense of the level of detail you might want, but you should absolutely customize it to fit your situation, because obviously not every state is going to have fiscal disparities, but they do in Minnesota, so Corey added it.
Yeah, that's right. And also, once the revenue categories and expenditure categories are established, the light blue cells you see in column A, you only have to do that once, because we want to use the same categories, including any non-recurring categories you want to include for revenues and expenditures. But then those same categories will appear regardless of the time period. So the light blue cells are meant to be where you plug in dollar amounts. Any cell that's not shaded like that, though, you want to stay out of, because we don't want to, it's Excel, so we don't want to corrupt the formula or what have you. But if you kind of scroll down the page, step 3, you're putting in last year's history, 12-month history. When you get to step 4, you'll see that now your revenue expenditure categories are not shaded. They're pulling down from where you plugged in that light blue in the light blue cells. Now in the previous 12 months, you're putting that history in as well. And the point of having historic data is that it gives you the basis for quickly taking your annual budget and establishing a monthly baseline. And it's against that monthly baseline, then you'll be making your adjustments for what's actually happening this year. And so if you go down to the next step, step 5 and step 6, this is where we do a couple things. One, for purposes of real quickly projecting salaries and benefits, it's not perfect or exact, but by inputting your pay periods per month for the current year, it'll take your annual budgets for salaries and benefits and spread them that way. Now you can fine tune that in a subsequent step you'll see, but it's a quick way to spread your salary and benefits based on an annual budget. You'll see though that in this case, all of the monthly values here are calculated values only. The only input you do is the annual budget. Now, that's the starting point in step 5 and 6 for the current year. Now we're going to modify that further down in step 7, and let's write down a little bit further. So step 7 is basically at the beginning of the period, if nothing was going to happen to your timeline or your forecast, then what you might have in the previous step might serve as your current year, estimate. But obviously that's not what's happening today. So what we want to do is track in the current fiscal year your actuals month by month for the same revenue and expenditure categories. In this example, January, February, March are actuals. And then the remaining 9 months of this fiscal year, we designate estimate. And the estimate can be, as a starting point, maybe you grab that calculated value in the table up above and modify it. I'm going to take my monthly expectation for property tax or sales tax or charges for services, and I'm going to multiply it by 0.9 or 0.5, or maybe all of it's going to go away, depending on the current situation. But you can use these light blue cells in that manner. You can plug in a whole number. You could reference another value and multiply it. I mean, just like you do with a normal Excel worksheet, just keep in mind that the light blue cells, are the only places you want to do that work. And so now what we have is an estimate for year end, the total for 2020, and it's based on the sum of those 12 months of inputs. So if you go down to step 8, kind of rounding this whole thing out, this is for the next fiscal year. Now, normally, if pre-COVID-19, we could maybe focus on the current fiscal year and just very quickly project the year after that using an escalator, let's say, against an annual number. But because of the actual nature of what's happening, and most local governments have a June 30 year end, we need to also be very precise in projecting the next 12 months. And so this gives you the ability to kind of using the same methodology in the table up above, project out your what you think might be your revenues and expenditures by month going into the next 12-month period. And if you scroll down one more step to the last step, what this step 9, the table here, just summarizes your totals based on all the tables up above for these same categories. You've got 2018, 2019, 2020, 2021, and now for that third 12-month period in our 36-month forecast, now we simplify it. We just put in an escalator or an average growth rate or whatever you want to call it in 2022. So that is the percentage change that would be based on your 2021 estimate. Now, when you plug all this stuff in, you go to tab 3 to see the results, and that would be the cash chart.
Go ahead there, Chris.
Yeah, can you hear me?
Yeah, please do.
Okay, very, very good. And so what this chart does is automatically pulls in, it labels for you automatically, what you put in tab 2. It's a general fund. It shows you the peaks and valleys, your inflows and outflows, and what your balances are. And if you scroll down right beneath the chart, there's some other items here too. It will calculate the monthly net for each 12-month period in this 36-month chart. It shows it on a cumulative basis for that fiscal year. And then beneath that, it repeats essentially what you had for your revenue groups and your expenditure groups. Kind of gives you a little pro forma there with a net result at the bottom. Now you notice in the light blue cells there's a starting balance. So here's that apples to apples. It's very important. Whatever you're projecting, your revenues, expenditures, inflows, outflows, what have you, make sure that they're apples to apples in their timing and how you're defining them with the balance that you're trying to project. And so in this example, this is in thousands of dollars, and so we have $60 million as the starting balance. And then in the light blue shaded row 45, this shows an actual balance. And so what you can do month by month is put in your actual balance from your bank statements or wherever you track your actual balances, and then compare that to what the model said. And so in this example, we're comparing 3 months of actual ending balances that are noted in the light blue with the cash position in the chart up above, and they're really close. They're very close. And maybe they're not precise because of maybe there's some working capital adjustments or accruals or minor things that weren't quite picked up. But in any case, this is a really close match. Now, if you're way off, if you're 5%, 10% off, then that's a sign that you need to go back and check, make sure you're apples to apples. So that the super simple version of this is just tab 3 by itself, and you literally input all of your values in the cells for all the revenue groups and month by month, and so it's it's a more flexible model to use. Certainly, if you wanted to modify it, you could do that. And so that's the difference between this model and the super simple, is that the super simple is tab 3 standalone, and you can input straight into this table.
All right, thank you, Chris. Appreciate that. And just again to remind everybody, the YouTube video has more detailed walkthrough of this, where you can rewind to your heart's content and rewatch different parts if you need to hear Chris explain kind of different elements of this model in more detail. I think it was about a 20-minute explanation of the model, so you can check that out. So we have a couple of questions here that this brings up, and I think are also relevant to some of the concerns that were stated early in the webinar, and probably one of the bigger ones is, well, we're in a very challenging time. So how do you really think about forecasting when we're in this less stable environment? What sort of strategies might we use? And maybe I'll kick it off. Chris, maybe something you didn't mention, and then I think the guys, Corey and Stefan, mentioned was scenario planning. How do you recommend people use this model for scenario planning?
Well, with this model, it's easy to create multiple scenarios, and actually a quick way to do it is just save multiple files, because it's such an abbreviated Excel workbook. There's not much happening here, just 4 pages essentially. So you can either create a baseline scenario, which would be the pre-COVID scenario, let's say, where this is how we thought the year was coming out, and then you have alternative scenarios, like if based on when we think the economy is going to come back, whether it's going to be mid-year, late fall, early next year, you can create multiple, basically going into the data input and assumptions page, create multiple different assumptions regarding the revenues and expenditures for that, and then save them. You can just change the file name, baseline, best case, worst case, however many scenarios you want to create. And normally, you want to get too many scenarios going on, because then it just gets confusing, especially for decision makers who are trying to look at this and get a sense of what the range is between best case and worst case. So the classic baseline versus best, worst, or favorable, unfavorable around the baseline. You could also, depending on how you want to use Excel, if you want to do it on your own, you could create worksheets within the same workbook, and do it that way too. So you have multiple scenarios all contained in a single workbook. But that's, given the simplicity of this model, that would probably be the way to go. Obviously, a more robust, more detailed kind of modeling would allow you to, be a lot more creative and flexible with activating different scenarios. But that's not what the design of this model is not intended to do that.
So simple is good. That's why we're here. Corey or Stefan, anything you want to add to that about this issue on forecasting in a crisis? Any other kind of insights you'd like to share with the group?
Yeah, well, I guess from my perspective, looking at the model, I liked how you could put in, we kind of used our budget for 2020 in our general forecast, but then when you could put in 2020, what's really happening, if you look at the transit tax and the and stuff, we've already forecasted in there the decline that we're currently, kind of those graphs I showed you that we showed the board, those are already reflected in the model. And we did that purposefully because this gives you a chance, at least the model gave us a chance to be able to take a look and think about these, some of the major categories and what impacts there might be. And part of it is you just got to get in there and say, okay, what makes sense and how am I going to approach this going forward? So, Stefan, anything?
Yeah, I agree with what you're saying. I would also like to add that be conservative. Run a couple of scenarios, run an optimistic one, a worst case scenario, a couple scenarios in the middle, and to kind of see where your pinch points will come out to be and act accordingly. Take steps to remedy those pinch points as best you can. And of course, with this cash flow, use it as a tool, but also use it to report up to your management or even the elected board.
Yeah, and Stefan, you bring up a great point. Is you brought up the idea of pinch points, and the one of the questions here was about grantors or funders having their own cash flow problems. It sounds like what you're suggesting could be used then to help you manage that, to say if, well, you know, we might get some revenues coming in late, looking for those pinch points could help you better kind of manage that and recognize them as potential risks. Is that right? Or how would you respond to the question?
Yeah, absolutely. We have contacted all of our grantors and got to see what the basis of the grant is. In some cases, we were pretty far along in the process and those were secure. In some other cases, it's a line item perhaps in next year's budget from the state, so that might be more vulnerable, right, to be stricken or to be reduced or to be delayed. So even within the grants, there's a lot of different types of grants and types of sources. Each of them will be impacted differently, and you need to be aware of those as well.
Yeah, okay, great point. This might be a Corey question, but anyone can take it here. The question is, I'd imagine you want to prepare this for each fund individually where there are major revenues, or would you recommend preparing for the entity as a whole? I know Chris has the model, you could do either, but kind of Corey or Stefan, any thoughts on kind of the scope? Like if you're starting out here, like what should your scope be in terms of funds?
I think it's a great question. It depends on how your cash is structured. If you pooled everything, then you can run it by pool. But if you keep certain enterprise funds or airports or water companies separately, then you would have a few different models running simultaneously and managing each of them to see where those issues may arise.
All right, awesome.
Yeah, Stefan and Shane, I just want to jump in. Just to show in our model, it says general fund. This is actually holistically because we run a fully pooled cash scenario. And so this is our full pooled cash scenario. So, but yeah, I agree with Stefan on those.
Thank you. Let's see here. Now, this is another question I think for you guys is some folks are wondering if got like proprietary software that you're using to complement this. Meaning the Excel is obviously completely open source, or so to speak. But the question is there proprietary software that you guys are using to like help with the forecast, or what's like feeding in data to this, or what's kind of behind this?
We use Excel. We use the sources, the data sources looking back are from our ERP system, right? But then we plug everything into Excel and use the model. I know that there's larger ERP systems that have cash flow forecast modules. You could certainly use that as well. But Excel is a very good tool for this kind of exercise. It's quick to stand up. It's quick to modify. And I have absolutely no problem using that.
I guess for Anoka on this, we use for the investment information, we're using a product called Track, and that tracks all our investments. So that helps us with the investment income and some of those things you see in here. It's off our ERP system, but we're using Excel sheets or reports that we generate from the system that is being put in by our treasury into Excel. So that way we kind of keep it that way. It's back to that Excel base too.
All right, very good. And we have one other question I think might be a Corey Stefan question. I think it may be related on and Corey brought up earlier with the pinch points is the idea that with property taxes for various reasons in different states, you know, there might be delays in property taxes. similar advice to what we were talking about with grants, where you want to use your cash flow model to recognize those pinch points, or other additional thoughts on that?
Well, yeah, with grants, like I said, I mean, you want to make sure you understand the grants, where the sources come from, and talk to the grantors, see what their sense is as far as any kind of delays in funding. And then, of course, there are also the new federal and state stimulus grants, to understand those as well and layer those in. But I would always suggest to be conservative. It's better to assume that they're coming in a month later and then be surprised than have it the other way around and be short of cash.
Yep. Well said. I think that's probably a good note to end this on, because I am not seeing any more questions come up. So I want to thank everybody, for all our panelists, for being here today and giving us some fantastic information. And again, we've got on the slide the contact information for folks. If you'd like to write anybody on our presenters, you can feel free to do that. Or if you'd like to download the resources, there is the link, and then just go to the page for this course and you'll have everything.